everyone, I'm Dr. Surbhi Uniyal. I teach philosophy at Jindal Global Business School, OP Jindal Global University. We're doing a series on philosophy of business. Every time a company decides to enter a new market, lay off 1,000 employees, set the price of the life-saving drug, or claim that its product is the best, it is making decisions that are not merely financial or strategic. In fact, they are philosophical. They rest on assumptions about what is good, what is true, what is fair, and what human beings ultimately are. Business, in other words, cannot escape philosophy, even when it seems it is only doing arithmetic. Students in the business schools usually learn how to build discounted cash flows, models, and conduct SWOT analysis, but rarely they ever pause to ask, what does it even mean to say that business succeeded? Whose definition of success are we using? These are important philosophical questions. So in this lecture series, we will introduce philosophy of business as a serious intellectual discipline. It asks what philosophy offers business practitioners and thinkers, surveys the major philosophical tools most useful in commercial contexts, examines the great philosophical models of leadership, and argues that philosophical literacy is a professional necessity. So basically, to talk about what is philosophy of business, or why is philosophy important for business students or people in any organization, why is a grounding on philosophy is important, is what we are going to deal with in these lectures. We'll talk about what are the major philosophical tools that helps in the different organizational contexts. We will also examine what are the great philosophical models of leadership, and we will argue that this philosophical literacy is in fact a necessity in the professional life. So let us begin with why philosophy matters in business. One might reasonably ask, why should a future manager or entrepreneur bother with philosophy? So philosophy, as we know, trains the capacity for clear conceptual thinking. Leaders often use words like innovation, culture, value, purpose, and stakeholders, as though everyone in the room shares the same understanding, which they rarely do. So philosophical training teaches one to interrogate these concepts, identify the hidden ambiguities, and build definitions that can actually bear the weight of organizational actions. So to talk about innovation or maybe the purpose of an organization, a leader might think that everybody thinks in the same way as though he or she believes in, but that's not a necessity, right? So with an understanding of philosophy or with the philosophical training, it helps us in interrogating these concepts further, in also identifying what are the hidden ambiguities within these different contexts. And it helps us in building definitions that can actually bear the weight of the organizational action. So philosophical reasoning it helps one to handle genuinely hard problems. That is, problems that have no algorithmic solutions. Many of the most consequential business decisions involve competing goods, irreducible uncertainty, and moral trade-offs. For example, should the pharmaceutical company price a new cancer drug at market rates, knowing that millions in low-income countries will die without access? Should an AI company deploy its technology knowing it will automate away the livelihoods of vulnerable communities? So these are not problems that spreadsheets can solve. They require the discipline of practical reason which philosophy teaches, which tells us what does it mean to value human life, and if we raise the price of a particular kind of drug, how would that impact a society or individuals? And these are the questions which we cannot solve through calculators or in the spreadsheets. We need for them practical wisdom, and the training of philosophy helps us in investigating these concepts deeper. So, philosophy can be understood as the foundation for professional integrity. Many ethical breakdowns in workplace do not happen because people lack technical expertise, but because they fail to carefully think through the moral consequences of their actions. So when individuals prioritize convenience, or they prioritize profits or authority over critical reflection, they risk making decisions that harm others. So a person trained in philosophical thinking is better equipped to question assumptions, recognize ethical dilemmas, and take responsibility for their choices, not because philosophy guarantees good behavior, but because it encourages deeper awareness of what is at stake in every decision. So it helps one to think of various possibilities, to think of the ethical dilemmas and how one can solve these ethical dilemmas that one often encounters in an organization. How do we take the responsibility of the choices that we have made, right? And how do we think of different assumptions if we are trying to launch a product? How do we have to think through the different types of consequences that it can involve? And through this deeper awareness, through self-reflection and through thought experiments, we can think better about these issues and situations that we often encounter in an organization. So philosophy is also essential for grappling with questions about the very purpose of business. Debates over stakeholders versus shareholders, and whether corporations truly have social obligations are, at their core, philosophical issues framed in economic terms. So to engage with them meaningfully, one needs the tool that philosophy provides. So how do we balance this? How do we solve these dilemmas that we are often encountering, whether we have to focus more on profit making or whether we have to deal with the corporation truly that have social obligations? How do we take sides? How do we solve these problems? And how do we raise the most fundamental question in business, that is, what is the purpose of business? Is it profit making, or is it something else, or is it something which is more than just profit making? And these types of questions again cannot be solved in spreadsheets through numbers. These problems can be solved by deeper investigation, and philosophy provides us tools to solve and think deeper about these very fundamental questions, like what is the purpose of business, which we might think might be a very easy to say that the purpose of business is profit making, but is it really so? Is what we investigate when we deal with it philosophically. So philosophy pushes us to ask whether profit should be the ultimate goal, or is it just one part of a broader social mission? It also helps clarify what businesses owe to society and how they should balance competing interests in a fair and responsible way. So this is again very important, that how do we think about competing and how do we balance these competing interests in a fair and a responsible way, and how do we think about whether the businesses and the organization, what do they owe to the society at large. So thinking about whether profit making is our ultimate goal or do we have to serve a broader social mission is what is possible through philosophizing. Now to think about these, we also require certain philosophical tools which help us in thinking about these problems and solving these problems philosophically. So philosophy offers business thinkers a rich toolkit. These are not abstract academic instruments, but practical reasoning capacities that change how we think, argues, decides and leads. And we can adopt different philosophical tools in doing that. One of them is critical thinking. So critical thinking is a disciplined and active and analytical process of evaluating arguments, assumptions and evidence to form rational, justified beliefs. This method enables philosophy to move beyond intuition or opinion toward well-justified conclusion and disciplined intellectual inquiry. So through this tool of critical thinking, we are able to analyze a possibility, a problem, by thinking about it in a more systematic, logical manner, and we can move from intuition or opinion towards a well-justified conclusion, which is a valid and well-established conclusions. How? Through a disciplined intellectual inquiry. Second is Socratic method. So Socratic method is about asking led questions rather than asserting answers. So it transforms defensive conversations into a collaborative inquiry. So through a sequence of guided questions, it encourages critical reflection, clarification of concepts and self-examination. Rather than transmitting answers, it aims to stimulate deeper understanding and lead individuals towards reasoned insight. Just like how Socrates used to adopt this method when people used to ask him questions. Rather than giving them answers, he used to ask them led questions, and eventually by analyzing these questions, one would reach to an answer. In the similar way, we can adopt this Socratic method, which is about a sequence of guided questions. And these guided questions and led questions encourages critical reflection. And through this critical reflection, through the clarification of the concepts, and through self-examination, one would eventually reach to an answer. So rather than just giving them a ready-made answers, we can adopt this kind of layered reasoning or layered questioning, which helps us to think deeper and to understand and eventually lead the individual towards this reasoned insight. So in strategic planning and problem diagnosis, the Socratic method functions as a disciplined corrective or to groupthink, that how we can as a group think about a solution by raising these kinds of layered questioning. For example, when a leadership team agrees too quickly on a course of action, the Socratic questionnaire or the questioner can ask in this particular situation, what exactly do we mean by growth here? What assumption is this strategy resting on? Or what would have to be true for this fail? Each question does not attack the position directly, but invites the team to examine what they actually believe. This is what we call layered reasoning. So in leadership and management, the Socratic method challenges the instinct to simply give answers. A leader who asks, "What do you think we should do and why?" rather than immediately prescribing solutions, does several things at once. They develop the reasoning capacity of their team. They surface informations and perspectives they would not otherwise hear, and they build a culture where positions must be justified rather than merely asserted. So we can see in this particular situation that how do we use this Socratic method. And as has been stated here, that a leader, let's say there's a group meeting or there is a decision that has to be taken. So a leader can ask such a question like, what do you think we should do and why do you think we should do that? Rather than immediately giving his own solutions that we should do this particular thing, they can develop a reasoning capacity of their team, and this would then lead to the surface informations and perspective they would not otherwise hear. So asking others that what do you think we should do in this particular situation helps the other team members to investigate and come up with different solutions. With this, they also built a culture where positions must be justified rather than merely asserted. So it's not about asserting the authority, but about how we can justify that position by encouraging such kind of questions and by encouraging others to participate in looking for the solutions. The other kind of philosophical tool apart from Socratic method is thought experiments. Thought experiments are a philosophical tool used to test ideas by imagining hypothetical scenarios. They help clarify concepts, explore moral intuitions, and examine the implication of theories without relying on real world experimentation. So in thought experiments, we are not conducting actual real world experiments. Rather, what we are trying to do here is we are testing the ideas by imagining a hypothetical scenario, that what our business organization might face, what are the different situations we might be in, and by thinking about such hypothetical scenarios, one would clarify their own concepts, they can explore their moral intuitions, and they can examine the implication of the theories or implication of, let's say, if they introduce a new product, what are the different kind of possibilities that it can have. For example, imagine you are leading a team and debating whether to enter a market with questionable labor practices. So instead of jumping to policy, you might pose a simple thought experiment here. Like you can say, if our company's name appeared tomorrow in a headline describing these conditions, would we be proud? And thinking about such situation that if this happens, if this headline comes about talking about these types of labor practices in our organization, how would we feel? How would our stakeholders and shareholders would respond in such a kind of a situation? And this is thought experiment where you are thinking deeper, you're thinking about what situations we might be in. So the deepest reason thought experiment matters in business is that they create distance between the decision maker and the decision. So in the heat of real solutions, pressure, self-interest, social conformity and cognitive bias all distort judgments. So we need to think of such situations beforehand, and it helps us in becoming more confident, be ready with different solutions, because we have already thought of the different kind of situations we might be in. So thought experiments strips these away and asks, what do you actually think when you think clearly? That question, asked seriously and honestly, is one of the most valuable things philosophy contributes to commercial life. And through thought experiment, we can think of such possibilities which help us in thinking clearly in a more structured way and thinking about the situations we might enter into and how would we solve that. So therefore, it becomes very important as a tool using thought experiment to think about such possibilities, which helps us in getting ready for such kind of possibilities and how would we solve them if at all we encounter such problems in future. So these were the different types of philosophical tools which can help us in different ways in our organizational setup, in thinking about a product launching and thinking about various situations that our organization might be in a critical thinking way, or using Socratic method or thought experiment in a more structured way about how and what do we think our business is about and how do we deal with different situations that we might encounter. Now let us think about how we can use different other philosophical theories and how we can relate that in the business setup. So talking about ethics and moral reasoning in organization. Ethics is the branch of philosophy most relevant to business. And three major normative ethical theories which offer distinct lens through which commercial decisions can be evaluated. So within philosophy, ethics is that branch of philosophy which helps us in thinking about what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. So it tells us what one needs to do and what one needs to avoid. Within this, there are three normative ethical theories, and we'll see that how these three normative ethical theories like utilitarianism, Kantian deontology and virtue ethics, how would these three types of normative ethical theories help us in different ways in business decisions? We think about how we need to think about the rightness of action depending on these three different normative ethical theories. Let's say if a business decision is justified, how do we analyze that justification from these three different major ethical theories?